All right, Danny, this is episode 4 of Gen Z Explained. We've had a little break since we last filmed these episodes, and this is actually our post-election special episode.
Autopsy, yes.
Yes, it's May the 5th. We've just had the election weekend. We've had a landslide Labor victory, which has been touted as quite historic. And we are here to talk about Gen Z and politics and break down the issues that mattered for Gen Z in this election.
I'm Danny. The Prime Minister when I was born was John Howard.
I'm Jessy, and the Prime Minister when I was born was also John Howard.
When were you born?
1995.
He really stuck around. I was 2005.
Yes.
Is he still alive?
Yes.
Oh my God, good for John.
And topically, you know, John was a very long-serving prime minister. Me and John are first name terms. John was a very long-serving prime minister, and there was a lot of commentary over this weekend that Albanese, in having won 2 consecutive victories, is actually the first prime minister to do so in the last 21 years since Howard.
Exactly. And as we've talked about before, the backdrop for my and my Gen Z peers' upbringing has been just this swift concatenation of revolving door prime ministers, Rudd, Gillard, Rudd, Abbott, Morrison, Turnbull, but now the steadfast Albanese.
Yes, maybe you will come of age in a time of stability and prosperity.
I think that is probably not the case, given I'm 19 and the President of the United States used to be the star of The Apprentice.
This is Gen Z Explained, not Gen Z. Do you know what I mean?
So we're here to do an election autopsy, and I think we are both quite interested in Ozpol. We've been following this election pretty closely. I was pretty glued to the ABC coverage on election night and then in checking all of the key seats since then. How about you?
Same. I was at the pub for election night. It was kind of loud, so I didn't really get to hear Anthony Green do his swan song, but he's so cute. But yeah, what's your first question? What do you want to know?
My first question, Danny, is there was a lot of commentary in this election about how now Gen Z and millennials together are the largest voting bloc and now outnumber any other generation. Of course, that is quite a large age range. It's everyone from 18 through to 44, so some quite different life stages in there. But regardless, young people was a really important voting bloc for all of the parties in this election to appeal to. What I'm keen to know from you is, from you and your peers, what were the issues that you guys were tracking most closely? What were the issues that made a difference and how you voted?
Well, firstly, completely right about the importance of young people as electoral power. 2022, the AEC report suggested that for the coalition, young people were one of the 3 demographics that deserted them then. 2022, of course, was meant to be the coalition's massive breakdown. They've since had an even bigger one. And equally in that election, the Greens, the 4 youngest seats in the country with the highest number of young people, were won by the Greens.
Right.
So, and of course,
so
this
Melbourne,
election,
Brisbane, Ryan.
Yeah. Griffith. And of course, this election, while the demographic breakdown isn't yet known, only 2 days ago, voting still being counted, the Greens have had their highest total primary vote ever. So the question you asked about issues that are important to young people, I think gathering this just from partly the landslide Labor victory, but what I hear my friends talking about, what's important is HEX. We are saddled with HEX debt, and the proposed 20% cut, the election promise that Albanese put forward, has been, I think, pretty popular. Free TAFE is another one. And then, of course, housing. But in terms of voting Liberal, voting Labor, voting Greens or Independent, I think character is a really important consideration for young people.
That's a great point.
And while I think Peter Dutton's massive loss has been attributed to him being, partly to him being unpalatable to all age groups across the country, I think none more so than among young people. You see when he lost his seat, the pub I was at, there was like screams everywhere. Less so for when Labor lost even.
For when Liberal lost?
Yes, yeah, sorry. And like the B2 Advocate posted holy fuck lol, and it got 70,000 likes when he was losing his seat. The Daily Oz did a post because he never came onto their show, and they were like 100% of the leaders who didn't come onto our podcast lost. That got tens of thousands of likes. There was like the credo, get the dick out of Dixon, his seat. So I think there was a young sort of, it's trendy to not like Dutton, but also I think that he just naturally didn't appeal to young people, his character.
Interesting.
Whereas Albanese might have more. And we'll talk a bit about why that
Interesting.
was.
I think there's been commentary that the Australian, that Oz poll has been becoming more presidential style in nature. There were 4 leaders debates between Albanese and Peter Dutton, and it did seem like the 2 proposed leaders of Australia were on show, and it was, you know, it wasn't necessarily voting for the Liberal Party or the Labor Party, it was voting for Albanese or Dutton, and the Greens ran on this mandate that, you know, they would never do a deal with Dutton specifically. So it does seem like maybe because we're in this context where there's the ability to get to know these people as characters and get to know their personalities and their backstories and their drivers via podcasts, via social media, that there was more of a spotlight put on character of leaders rather than the policies they were putting forward.
That checks out also the rise of the independents, including the Teals.
True.
My generation, more than any other, is not rusted on, is not voting in terms of the major parties. So, of course, for us, it's not so much Liberal or Labor, it's the people that we see. And you say for election debates, and it would probably be contested that, well, young people don't watch TV. But I think it's important to note that we're all on TikTok. Clips of the debates inevitably make their way onto social media. We see people stitching debate footage. So there'll be 5-second clip of Albo or Dutton speaking, then someone giving their reaction stitched into the to the footage. So we actually do get that, and that does cut through to us just in a different way. And it probably doesn't show up in the broadcast stats.
Yeah. What's your take on how the parties tried to communicate with and resonate with Gen Z in this election? And what do you think was successful versus perhaps a little bit cringe?
So much cringeness. We'll get to that. I think that, and there was a great article in the AFR about this. About Delulu? Did you see that one? I wrote that.
I'm not letting you have this.
Sorry. All right. How'd they engage with us? I think this goes back to the character thing we were talking about. Why was Peter Dutton so unlikable and Albanese so likable? Well, I don't know. Albo went on a string of podcasts. And I think the criticism here could be that he was preaching to the converted, but still things, while the internet is very siloed, sometimes spill over. He, for example, this is no word of a lie. My sister texted my family group chat saying, I'm voting for Albo. He's a girl's girl. I called her. I'm like, why? He joined her favourite podcast, Happy Hour, with Lucy and Nikki.
Okay.
And they talk politics towards the end. But it was honestly so funny. He sat down with them and they did their usual thing, which is relationship advice. That's what they do with their guests. And so it was like Albo talking about like, well, my first date with Jodie was at this place, so I think you should go to a place like this, or this is a green flag or whatever.
Yes.
And that's where the Delulu is the Solulu thing happened, where they asked him about slang, Gen Z slang. And one of the words was Delulu, which means delusional. And he said he was just like getting carried away. He was like a dad happy to be included in the conversation. He's like, I'm going to say that word in Parliament. And he did, and it went kind of viral.
Yeah.
So I think there was an authenticity to his engagement. He didn't take himself seriously, and he came across as quite gentle.
Yes.
Whereas Dutton didn't. I saw a post that the Liberals put out with a photo of Dutton as a young man as a police officer saying protector, and Albanese as a young man protesting, saying protester.
Right.
I think that actually is an ad for Albo for my generation. And like, he believes in something.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. He seems gentle, whereas Dutton seems quite like robust. And I don't know if that was so appealing to lots of young people.
Yeah. Okay. Were there any moments that you think that any party had that really cut through all of the kind of information that exists out there and convinced people?
Look, I think the Greens are often popular with young people, firstly because there's just this tacit understanding. Maybe if you don't know much about politics and you're looking at a ballot paper, you're like, yeah, the Greens are like environment, whatever, climate's important to young people. While you could say it's less important with the cost of living crisis, it's still a top 3 issue according to the Monash Uni study. So I think a moment could be when Adam Bant was DJing at a party and that went kind of viral. I think that was interesting. Another moment would have been Albo saying that the nuclear plan is Delulu and that Dutton doesn't have a Salulu. I don't know, but talking about how parties engage with young people, the Liberals sort of lent into brain rot, which I don't know if you've heard of this, is like internet humour of a sort of younger skew.
Yeah.
You've probably heard the phrase skibbity toilet riz. It's just like insanely brain, like,
Yeah.
it's just...
It's kind of devoid of meaning almost by intention, right?
Yeah, it's insane. Like they might make Elbow into an AI mouse and have, like, it's just bizarre.
Okay.
They lent into that.
So there was lots of digital ads of this content authorized by the Liberals.
And in a
right?
few minutes we're going to react to some of these clips.
Yeah.
For example, they did a diss track in AI against the Labor Party. Now, I think that probably was effective, but for people under 18, because that's where that humour sort of hits. So we talk a lot about Gen Z and how formative experiences change young people's outlooks. I think it's important to note, and maybe something that the Liberals missed, that within Gen Z, there are distinct differences. Like me as a 19-year-old Gen Zer has a completely different outlook to someone even just 7 years younger than me, because when I was growing up, there were certain technological advancements, for example, ChatGPT, which weren't yet made, different trends on social media and stuff.
Yeah. So I think they were like, oh, what's trending with young people? You know, what are the meme formats that are trending? Let's lift and shift those into election ads because that'll go off with the young'uns. I think there was quite a perhaps simplistic understanding of what's actually required to cut through and what earns someone's vote.
Equally, what feels manufactured versus what feels in the moment.
Yes.
So, I don't know. We mentioned the Greens earlier. Do you think they were successful with young people? Because there is the argument that in the past 2 years they've been quite radical, that their quite robust stance on issues such as Gaza, but also their unwillingness to compromise on housing has set them back in the eyes of the electorate. What do you reckon?
Yeah, well, I think, the Greens have kept their primary vote and they're going to be a very powerful force in the Senate. They have 11 senators between Labor and the Greens. They have a majority in the Senate. So now Labor only needs to do a deal with either the Greens or the coalition to get policies passed. So I think they will be influential in the Senate over the next 3 years. But they have gone backwards in the seats where they had lower House representatives. So Melbourne, Adam Bant's seat, Griffith, Max Chandler-Myers' seat. I think, there were some where they were hopeful of picking up seats like Will's. I think they've held on to Ryan. So it's clearly in the seats where they were local members, there has been a kind of swing against them and to the Labor Party. And I think some pundits have said, it's a rejection of extremism, it's a rejection of culture wars, that people didn't like how polarized the Greens were on, Gaza, and that they were seen as agents of social disharmony, and that the swing back to Labor represents a swing back to the center. I don't know. I think that, like in a context where maybe people's hip pockets are really what they're thinking about in this election, people want a party that seems more focused on those things rather than on foreign affairs. But I think that being said, the Greens are quite ideological in some of the things that they stand for, and I do think that that we don't see a lot of ideology in the major parties, that in some ways they're kind of interchangeable in this election. I think you saw a lot of hip pocket election promises where it wasn't so much that they had a definitive stance on anything in particular. They were just exchanging kind of different bribes of the Australian polity. So I personally think there is a role for some more ideological stances and consistency in those ideological stances in this election. But perhaps it's not something that is front of mind for a lot of Australians at this point in time.
I agree with you there about the idea of having a narrative, an ideological narrative. Think of my generation we're in the West, the most irreligious generation yet. Also, we're the least patriotic ever. So we're going without North Stars that previous generations had, going without those sorts of handrails. So what fills the vacuum? In America, for young men, it's a strongman leader like Trump, who might be able to give, and this is speaking generally, of course, who might be able to give some sort of real authority, some cult of celebrity that can fill that vacuum. And also, we've grown up in a discombobulating time with so much information competing for our attention. So we sort of sometimes seem to float towards the authority figures. And so in the Australian political scene, you're right, when Labor and the Liberals don't really have a vision that young people might be able to say, yes, this is what they want, this is what the future will look like under them. That does mean we might go towards the Greens. Equally, the alleged recklessness or radicalness of the Greens, which maybe turned off older busted on Greens voters, I think the reason they have still done okay and they're popular online with young people is because we might gravitate a bit towards recklessness because, hey, buying a house seems kind of impossible. Why should we care for the traditional major parties' promise of prudent economic spending when we don't have a stake in the economy and probably won't for a long time? Of course we're going to say fuck it.
Of course, both the major parties did try to make an appeal to young people on the issue of housing. So they both had flagship policies. Labor put out a policy around lowering the deposit required to secure a house to 5% and the government guaranteeing the rest of that deposit. So instead of having to save, $200,000 for a deposit on $1 million house, you now only need to put forward $50,000, making it a lot more achievable. Whereas the Liberal government said that they would allow people to access up to a certain amount their superannuation in order to pay for a house.
For a deposit,
for a deposit. What's your take as, an aspirant one-day homeowner about those policies which appealed to you?
Interestingly, I think it wasn't so much about the policies as their communication strategy with new media. So Claire O'Neill, the housing voice for Labor, she, for example, went on the Daily Oz podcast, the Daily Oz being a really popular news source in Australia for young people, which has they've cornered the market amazingly.
Yeah.
She went on the Daily Oz
agree.
early, and her sort of clips did the rounds, whereas Peter Dutton, as we've talked about, decline going on to the decline coming to Gen Z where they are. There was some talk that he did Sam Fricker, the diving influencers podcast. Again, he didn't really exit the echo chamber. The argument is often made against Liberals just generally that they spend too much time pandering to the Sky News crowd, that they're preaching to the converted. This is probably a continuation of that, in that they're not going to places in new media, online with influencers or whatever, where people who aren't voting for them are. So I think that it wasn't so much about the merits of the housing policies of the coalition or Labor. It was more that one of them was put out there for our consideration, whereas the other wasn't properly communicated.
Yes, okay.
The AFR was talking all about super for housing, but young people don't read the AFR. Yeah.
Interesting. So you're saying, just as important to swaying a young person on housing is not the kind of letter of the design of the policy you've put forward, but whether you are communicating them in the places where they frequent using sources they trust.
Equally, though, the major parties are hamstrung in doing this because we're pretty inclined to think, have you guys not been the ones who've been in power for the last, like, forever and are guilty of this? Like, Albo, we talk about his longevity. I was watching Julia Gillard's misogyny speech the other day and he's in the background, which is interesting. He's been in Parliament for like 20 years. Peter Dutton's been in Parliament since, I think, 2001. Lots of these politicians, maybe some young people view as accessories to the crime of fucking us over on housing. So, of course, we're going to gravitate to independents or to minor parties. But, yeah.
I'm curious to understand this view from, young people that there's been this problem with housing that's been created by older generations and that now young people have inherited it and they're suffering the brunt of not being able to afford houses. What do you think, what's behind that perception? What do you think is specifically the problem that's been created and what is the role of people who've been in power for a long time? How did they contribute to creating that problem?
So I think there's firstly the ABC has done a lot of reporting on this, the general fact that even 2 decades ago, the average wage to buy a home, you needed like 4 times the average wage to get that going. Now it's like over 10 times the average wage. I think there is the understanding that maybe starting with John Howard, there began this idea in Australia that homes are an investment and that there's something that we've seen the last 20 years, the astronomical appreciation of house prices. And there's now this perception that that's like what's meant to happen. And in my opinion, for there to be a solution to the housing crisis, we need to help supply, but also we need to sort of change the thinking around this, frankly, unsustainable sentiment that houses are something that should always continue to be going up in prices. So I don't know. I think that negative gearing's got to do with it, but I think just vaguely and frankly speaking, I don't know if young people think too much about it. I think there's just a sort of resentment and just the knowledge that like for our grandparents, I don't know, they got like some beads off the ground and traded them for a house or whatever like you did then.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's sort of impossible. I don't know.
But I actually think it's not the best that people are forming their view on which party best serves their interests or could help them based on just the communication and, what they're seeing of these parties' policies based on a few clips on TikTok. Because in some ways, Liberals' super for housing policy, it copped a lot of flack from progressive influencers who said, this is a terrible policy because we're allowing young people to ransack their super and it would be a form of stealing from your future self in order to buy a house, and that's not the best way to do it. I think there's like a little bit to that, but I think that if you kind of drill below the level of headlines, what accessing your super to put down a deposit on a home does is it allows you to lever up your super. So you can take $50,000 out of your super and then you can access a mortgage for the rest of that home deposit. And then any appreciation in the home price goes fully to you, but you've been able to kind of lever up that $200K deposit into a $1 million house. So that could actually be quite good for a young person. It could increase their wealth when they're ready to retire. And there's also the point that, owning your own home is one of the biggest indications of whether you are likely to have a good retirement, more so than having a larger super balance, right? So in some ways, that policy was actually something that could have really helped young people. It could have been, better for some young people than the 5% deposit guarantee, but I don't think it was necessarily debated at the level of the merit of the policy and the granularity. It was really just the vibe of it.
I'm a proponent of the vibe, and let me tell you why. Because sue us for seeing these politicians like struggle to enunciate in a way that resonates with us their message. Of course we're going to be suspicious of them. I see in a perfect world we should be evaluating their competing housing policies based on their individual merits. But when we see, for example, the Super for Housing, the Liberal Party in a heavy-handed sort of fashion trying to like put that down our throats on TikTok, and it just doesn't have any authenticity to it, and it seems stale and it seems forced.
Interesting.
We're probably going to think these people don't get us and therefore distrust the policy. I don't know, but I do think that in general, social media and politics should not be mixed. Of course, they're going to be mixed because that's like where we live our lives. But as a medium, it's diametrically opposed to politics is meant to be serious and substantial and long form and deliberative and be a long discussion about real topics, whereas social media is about short form content that is the algorithms promote the inflammatory and the incendiary.
Yeah, but I would say that trend towards short form and that taking over politics is actually something really regrettable. Like I think that in the past, before television, people, really had very considered policy positions.
Yeah,
they
I
wrote
agree.
wrong
Yeah.
letters. There was more bipartisanship because they just had a kind of dialogue about what was the best way to attack this issue. People adopted more policies from the other side if they were grounded in sound, economic modeling. But these days it seems like it's far more polarized, and you don't want to be seen as agreeing with the other side. You want to kind of present a distinction, even if the policy that they've put forward is actually quite sound. So you see, the coalition not supporting Labor's tax cuts, even if they're kind of quite aligned with what the Liberal base would probably want. Isn't it quite regrettable that social media has contributed to this world in which we only engage with politics through the frame of these digestible sound bites that miss a lot of the nuance and miss a lot of how it actually would work?
That I agree with. There's this great book written by Neil Postman in 1985 called Politics in the Age of Show Business. And he laments the rise of television. And he talks about the 1960 presidential election, one in which it was the first televised debate. And he contends that a main reason for which Kennedy beat Nixon was because Kennedy was really hot. And he was really hot. I don't know if you've seen. Kennedy, like not the current one.
Yeah,
He's not hot. What was I saying? Oh. And so that was 1985. And he was like, the introduction of a visual medium into politics means that we've ceded substance.
Yes.
Politicians must now be entertainers. He talked about the fact that Ronald Reagan, the president at the time of writing, was a former TV star. I don't know what he'd think about the fact now we have a former reality TV star as a president, but whatever. Mobile phones then, he died in like 2000. Mobile phones are televisions writ large. They're ubiquitous. They're portable. We go on them all the time. And at least on TV shows, you could still have some form of long form discussion. Whereas now, and as I've mentioned, politicians have to compete with memes and cooking videos and influencers to grab our attention. So of course, those moderates and centrists who have thoughtful ideas are going to die in the savannah of like people competing for the hottest of hot takes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, because politicians now have these different channels that they can use to get their message out there, such as interviews with influencers who are, reality TV
They're not held
stars,
accountable.
that means they can sometimes dodge journalists, like, political journalists, who might ask more challenging questions. Famously, Trump rejected a whole bunch of debates that was going to be facilitated by a television anchor to favor something that happened on Truth Social, right? So I think it's kind of regrettable that,
and it happens on the left as well, though. I mean, we applaud Albanese's like multivarious podcast strategy, but often they were sympathetic podcasters. Yeah,
like explicitly, Abby Chatfield said, disclaimer, this is going to be a biased podcast because my goal is to help elect Albanese and keep Dutton out. So I think you questioned the ability for her to kind of hit him with hardball questions and really, interrogate some of the policies he put forwards.
The argument against what we're saying would be to posit that Gen Z is more informed and more engaged in the political process because of social media.
Do you think they are? Do you think I think they like have fragments of impressions,
Yes.
but I don't know
The vibe,
if
yeah.
they have, actually sat with these policies and really thought about, whether they're economically sustainable or, how they would actually benefit from these competing.
And what's the trade-off? Like maybe if we are more informed, we are being informed about a shittier politics because it's like social media politics. I wrote an article like a year and a half ago about why we should lower the voting age.
Oh, okay.
I now think we should raise it to 25. Seriously, yeah, seriously.
All right, Danny, it's time for our Is It Cringe of the day. Is it cringe if parents use apps such as Life360 to track their kids?
No, do you know why? My family has Life360.
Yeah.
And it has proven a fantastic way of tracking my parents. Seriously, I for a time thought mum was having an affair because she'd always be like spending hours at 3, I think it was Marshall Street in South Melbourne. And once I confronted her about it and she was getting massages in her workday.
Oh, okay.
So it's a good way of keeping a check on your parents. And my parents are semi-retired now and they play a lot of golf.
Right.
And so if they try and have the gall to tell me I'm not working hard enough or something, I'll be able to say, well, where were you from the hours of 11 till 4 today?
Okay. So it's
Right?
not cringe because there's a reciprocity to it.
I think it depends on the resourcefulness of the children in question who are being tracked. Like it definitely goes both ways.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of? In Harry Potter, the Weasleys have like a clock.
I thought you were going to say the map that has all the footsteps.
Oh, true. That as well. Yeah, that as well.
Molly's
but the
clock,
Weasleys have
yeah.
a clock about where the kids are and it's like in mortal peril or at school or at work.
Okay.
So Life360 is kind of like that.
Yeah. I think it just depends on how you use it. But
Would you track a significant other? Would you ask?
I don't really like being tracked. But yeah, I probably would.
You'd ask them?
Well, people like send your location on like Find My Friends.
Yeah.
At a time, like you might need to find them and then it doesn't go away. So you sort of do have, it's often convenient. I don't find myself using the feature that much though. Would you? Would you track your employees?
On-call clock. If my partner asked if they could track me, that would give me a serious ick.
I think there's a very different attitude for your generation and mine.
Right, okay.
Like we've talked about the Snap Map on Snapchat before. Like
Yeah.
everyone sees where everyone is.
Yeah.
Which is low-key cray.
Okay, Danny, so now it's time for our listeners' question of the day. I think you got sent this question on LinkedIn, and it was from somebody who wanted to know, does Gen Z's attitude of cynicism actually drive any change, or do they just spend a lot of time talking about things?
You mentioned LinkedIn. I encourage all our viewers to follow me on LinkedIn.
Yes.
I love LinkedIn. Do I think that? I don't know. We have been pointed to as this generation of protest, especially like during 2019, Greta Thunberg, school strike for climate, all this sort of stuff. Since then, we've sort of retreated, haven't we? And deprioritized issues like climate when our hip pockets have started to hurt. I don't know that we're like super cynical. In some ways, we're hopeful. I think it's hard to talk about this particular question without generalizing. I mean, we have kind of been raised, I'm from Victoria in Australia, and in the curriculum, we learn a lot about climate change growing up. It's kind of hard not to be cynical when we learn that we've inherited from our parents and grandparents like a burning rock. So,
I think maybe cynicism is the wrong word, but I would say that Gen Zs do seem to be quite anti-establishment and, not the biggest fan of like working towards incremental change from within the system. Does that resonate?
yes. So we talked in a previous episode about the stat that more than 50% of Gen Z want to be CEO
Right.
in corporate spaces, which is
Yeah.
like a massive increase from previous generations in the workforce. And some people call this entitlement, others would call it ambition. I think that does bleed through to all parts of life. It's about instant gratification. But we've kind of been conditioned to have instant gratification because when you were growing up, if you wanted dinner, I don't know what, you had to like go outside and get the conch, like, and like summon a like horse and then kill like maybe a cow. Whereas we have Uber Eats and it comes in 20 minutes. So of course we want instant gratification in all areas of life. And it's your fault for raising us that way.
That was funny.
Thanks.
That was really interesting chat, Danny. Thank you for tuning in to our election special of Gen Z Explained, where we talked about Gen Z and politics. If you like the show, we would love for you to review and like and subscribe and follow us on either Spotify or YouTube.
Or me on LinkedIn.
And follow Danny on LinkedIn. Until next time.
Bye.